Folklore. It's a word that gets tossed around a lot, but what does it even mean anyway? You probably already have an idea of what you think folklore is, and you're probably not wrong, but as you're about to find out, folklore means a lot more than what most people think it does. And yes, folklore is a real academic field of study. I'm Cassandra Coleman, a folklore student at Cape Breton University, and this is the Folklore Tree. Today, and over the course of this series, we are going to be exploring the question of what exactly is folklore and why is it important? When most people think of folklore, the things that cross their mind tend to be things like old songs, antiques, fairy tales, and dragons. And while these ideas aren't wrong, they present a small and incomplete version of what should be a vast and complex subject. Because the question of what folklore is capital B big, we're going to start small by defining some key terms. First, folk. Who puts the folk in folklore? In historical terms, folk referred to the everyday average working class people who lived in rural areas, aka peasants. The everyday and average parts still apply, but since most people don't really like being referred to as uneducated country bumpkins, surprise surprise, the definition of folk has been altered accordingly. In contemporary folklore studies, pretty much everybody is folk. Most of the time, folk just refers to the groups in which people from all walks of life interact with each other on an everyday, informal basis. We call these folk groups. What can I say? Folklorists like to keep it simple when it comes to naming things. Folk groups are just groups of people who are linked by a particular commonality, something like occupation, locality, or interests. They then build for themselves a sort of unofficial culture that surrounds that commonality. A folk group might be as small as a single family, or as large as like a religion, or a BBC show fandom. A single person can be part of lots of different folk groups throughout their lives, and they might join and leave many as they age. To better illustrate the basics of how folk groups work, I'm going to show you a visual representation. Let's go to the board. Take yours truly, for example. My family, as you might expect, is one folk group. I'm currently working as a waitress, which makes me part of an occupational folk group. I live in southern Ontario, so I'm part of the culture of local folk groups. I'm also a student at university, which is yet another kind of folk group. I also participate in a number of fandoms like Sherlock, Doctor Who, Pokemon, and Nerdfighteria. And so as you can see, you can start to get an idea of how the folk groups we participate in play a role in how we define ourselves and our relationship with other members of the group. Now that we've more or less defined the folk part, let's get to the lore part. While the folk refers to the people, the lore refers to the stuff, the paraphernalia, the meat and the sandwich, so to speak. Lore, in this case, refers to the way that members of a group communicate with each other and also express each other to others within the group. They can do this in a variety of ways. Things like songs and stories and language and homoerotic hulock watercolors shared on Tumblr. However, that doesn't mean just anything can be folklore. You might have a folk tale in one hand, a novel based on a folk tale in the other hand, and then a movie based on the novel based on a folk tale in yet another hand. Assuming you have three hands, I don't know. I'm not gonna assume. But just because they all have similar content doesn't make them folklore. The key characteristic that makes folklore different from, say, popular culture or elite culture is the ways in which it is transmitted. Novels and movies are stories just like folk tales are stories, but the folk tale is defined as folklore because it directly travels from person to person, unlike novels and movies which travel from one source to multiple sources at the same time. This leads us to the next key characteristic of folklore, its ability to adapt and change. Let's go back to the board. Movies and books are fixed. You can't change the media you're viewing, except maybe in fan fiction, but that's a topic for another day. And it'll always stay the same no matter how many times you view it. However, if you hear a story from another person and decide you might like that story better if, say, the lizard your friend was saying they found in their garden was actually a giant fire-breathing dragon with the voice of Benedict Cumberbatch, you would probably tell it like that, right? Sure, why not? And thus the story changes a little bit each time it makes the rounds in the community. It's a little bit like a game of telephone, except instead of traveling in a single circle, the story spreads and grows outwards, like a web or a tree. Dare I say it, a folklore tree? See what I did there? However, even though folklore is dynamic and changing, it's also conservative and traditional. Is your brain hurting yet? So how can folklore be both traditional and changeable? Well, a lot of that depends on how you define traditional. Like many of the terms we've discussed so far, what constitutes traditional is a big, complicated issue. For our purposes, traditional is going to refer to the practice of passing on skills, knowledge, information, language, other cultural elements from one person or generation to the next over a long period of time. For example, a folk tale told over the course of centuries is traditional, but then a chain email that's passed informally from one person to the next over a long enough period of time can also be considered traditional. So basically, the too long didn't read definition of folklore is it's the study study of traditional informal culture. Because folklore and traditional culture are so often considered to be fixed and unchangeable, it's often thought to be in decline. Even the earliest folklorists have historically feared the potential decline and disappearance of folklore. But it's not disappearing. Everyone has folklore, and everyone will continue to have folklore for as long as we have informal cultural exchanges. So why is it important to study folklore? There's a certain perception that people have of the study that it is quaint, outdated, trivial, or otherwise unimportant because it focuses on informal everyday interaction. However, I personally would argue that these things would not be a part of our everyday lives if they weren't important in some way. Understanding how people engage with and use folklore to communicate and express themselves can help us understand our culture and the ways it functions in ways that we might not otherwise consider. Folklore deals with how we interact with and understand ourselves and the world that we live in, and also how we give meaning to our lives. In short, studying folklore is just one of the ways that we can begin to better understand ourselves and each other. I would like to invite you to join me in this exploration of folklore so that together we might learn to better understand each other. This has been an episode of the Folklore Tree. I'm Cassandra Coleman, and thank you very much for watching.